The morning she found the child's drawing on her desk, a crayon house with 4 stick figures and the words "Our Family" spelled wrong in purple marker, Adrienne Voss had been married for exactly 6 hours. Her new husband didn't know she'd found it. He was somewhere in the building below, probably fixing the busted elevator for the 3rd time that month, hands covered in grease, acting like a man with nothing to hide, acting like a man who hadn't just upended her entire understanding of what she'd signed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. 4 weeks before that drawing changed everything. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like expensive coffee and quiet desperation. Adrienne sat across from 2 attorneys she didn't know, in a firm she'd never heard of, trying to keep her breathing even. She'd worn her gray blazer, the one that said serious without trying too hard, and she'd arrived 7 minutes early because that was the kind of woman she was. The kind who showed up prepared for things even when she had no idea what she was walking into, Mrs. Voss. The older of the 2 attorneys, a heavy-set man named Gerald Ashworth, according to the nameplate she'd clocked immediately, folded his hands on the table. "Thank you for coming. You said it was time-sensitive." She hadn't moved her hands from her lap. "I'm here." The second attorney was a woman, maybe 40, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and an expression like she'd already decided Adrienne would say yes. That expression annoyed her more than anything else in the room. "We represent a family with significant holdings in Hargrove Capital," Ashworth said. "You're familiar with them." She was. Everyone in Chicago's financial sector was familiar with Hargrove Capital. They didn't advertise. They didn't have to. "I know the name. The family is restructuring. Part of that restructuring requires a CEO who can step in immediately, command credibility with their existing board, and stabilize investor relationships that have become," he paused, "complicated. And you're coming to me." Adrienne kept her voice neutral. She'd spent 12 years earning a voice that didn't give anything away. "We're coming to you with a condition attached." The woman spoke for the first time. Her name was apparently nothing, because she still hadn't introduced herself. "The position comes with a partnership requirement. A temporary one, defined temporary 18 months. Ashworth cleared his throat. "The family patriarch, Howard Hargrove, is unwell. Before he passes, he wants to see his son settled, stable. The board has concerns about the son's, how to put this, unconventional lifestyle. Unconventional." Adrienne repeated the word carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means," the nameless woman said, "that Bennett Hargrove has spent the last 3 years working as a building superintendent in Pilsen. Voluntarily. He has a daughter. He has no interest in reclaiming his family's name, and the board will not approve a leadership transition that doesn't present a unified, credible family structure." Adrienne let that land. A superintendent. An heir to one of the most quietly powerful investment firms in the Midwest, fixing boilers and unclogging drains in a 6-flat in Pilsen. "You want me to marry him," she said, "for 18 months. In exchange, you receive the CEO position, a salary commensurate with the role, full assumption of your brother's outstanding medical debt, and a signing arrangement that would make your current consulting income look like a rounding error." Her brother's medical debt. 31 years old, a diagnosis that didn't care about timelines or fairness, and a stack of bills that Adrienne had been quietly rerouting her own savings toward for 8 months. She hadn't told anyone. She was not the kind of woman who told people. "How old is the daughter?" she asked. Ashworth blinked. Clearly not the question he'd been expecting. 5. Her name is Rosie. Her mother passed when she was 2. I want to meet him first. Ms. Voss, the timeline. Before I sign anything, Adrienne said, I meet him. Those are my terms. The nameless woman smiled for the first time. It looked like she'd just won something. The building in Pilsen was a 3-story brick walk-up with a small courtyard and a gate that needed oil. Adrienne found Bennett Hargrove in the basement, which she'd been told was where he'd be. She stood at the top of the stairs and called down. He came up slowly, the way people do when they're not surprised by visitors, but aren't expecting anything good from them either. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader through the shoulders. There was a smudge of something dark along his jaw, and he'd clearly been in the middle of something involving copper pipe. He looked at her the way mechanics and soldiers and people who'd survived things looked at strangers, quietly, completely, taking a full reading before committing to anything. You're the one they sent, he said. Not a question. I'm the one who insisted on coming. She extended her hand. Adrienne Voss. He wiped his palm on his work pants before shaking hers. Bennett Hargrove, though I assume you already know that. I know what they told me. I wanted to know what you'd tell me. He studied her for a moment. Then he said, Come in. I just put coffee on. The apartment was nothing like what the address suggested it should be. It was clean in the way that took effort, not money. A small kitchen, a living room with bookshelves that went to the ceiling, and in the corner near the window, a wooden table covered in paper and crayons, and what appeared to be an in-progress mural of a horse riding a bicycle. Bennett caught her looking at it. "Rosie's been working on that for 2 weeks," he said. "The horse keeps changing jobs. What was it last week? An astronaut. The week before that, a veterinarian." He handed her a mug. "She's not sure what she wants to be yet, so the horse is trying everything." Adrienne sat down at the kitchen table because he gestured to it and because she needed a moment to reset. She'd been expecting resentment, maybe, a man forced into something he didn't want, going through the motions. She hadn't been expecting this, whatever this was. "You know what they're proposing," she said. "I know." He sat across from her, wrapped both hands around his own mug. "They've been proposing versions of it for 2 years. I kept saying no. What changed?" Something shifted in his expression. "Not much, just enough. My father's getting worse, and Rosie's getting older." He looked at his coffee. "She starts kindergarten in the fall. She's going to need things I can't give her on a superintendent's salary. Not forever. Is that the only reason?" He looked up. "Is there supposed to be another one?" "Most people have more than one reason for things." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "My father built something real. I walked away from it because I was 24 and angry, and I thought principle was the same thing as wisdom. It's not." He turned his mug in his hands. "Someone should be there for the transition who actually gives a damn about what he built. The board won't accept me alone. So you need a wife. I need someone who can do the job I can't do yet, while I learn to do it." It wasn't a romantic answer. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was honest, and Adrienne had spent enough years in boardrooms with dishonest people to know the difference. "I need to meet Rosie," she said. He didn't argue. He just stood up, walked to the hallway, and called his daughter's name. Rosie Hargrove came into the kitchen wearing rain boots and a winter hat, despite the fact that it was 62 degrees in the apartment. She had her father's serious eyes in a rounder, softer face, and she stopped when she saw Adrienne with the kind of total stillness children have right before they make a decision about you. "Rosie, this is Ms. Adrienne. She's a friend of Dad's. She doesn't look like your other friends," Rosie said. "That's true," Bennett agreed. "She's different. Different how? She works in buildings like the one Grandpa Howard used to work in." Rosie considered this. Then she walked over to the table, picked up a green crayon, and handed it to Adrienne. "The horse needs a saddle," she said. "Can you draw one?" Adrienne could not draw. She'd never been able to draw. She sat down next to this 5-year-old and drew the worst saddle in recorded history, lumpy and lopsided and vaguely shaped like a cloud. Rosie looked at it for a long moment. "It's okay," Rosie said with the kind of generous diplomacy that 5-year-olds deploy when they're being kind. "We can fix it." They spent 40 minutes fixing the saddle. By the time Bennett came back from wherever he'd gone, giving them space, Adrienne realized the horse also had a flag and a hat, and Rosie had told her 3 important things: that green was the best color, that horses were smarter than people thought, and that her dad made the best grilled cheese in Chicago. "She likes you," Bennett said quietly from the doorway. "I just drew a terrible saddle. She doesn't give crayons to people she doesn't like." When Adrienne walked out an hour later, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the April air and thought about the contracts waiting for her and the salary figures and her brother's medical bills. Then she thought about a little girl in rain boots deciding whether to trust her. She called the attorneys. She said yes. The wedding happened on a Tuesday, City Hall, 2 witnesses, a judge who clearly had somewhere else to be. Adrienne wore a cream blouse she'd bought on her lunch break. Bennett wore a dark button-down, pressed, and he'd gotten the grease off his jaw. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Afterward, they stood on the steps and Adrienne thought, "I am married to a man I've spoken to 3 times. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and handed it to her. A photo from Rosie, sent through what appeared to be his aunt's phone based on the name. The horse now had a wedding veil. Bennett was smiling before he caught himself. "She figured it out," he said. "How?" "I told her we were going to a grown-up ceremony. She knows I don't do grown-up ceremonies." He took the phone back. "She's staying with my aunt for the next few days. While we move where?" Adrienne had assumed they were keeping separate apartments, River North. The family has a unit there, part of the optics. He looked at her. "They want us visible. Together. Real enough that the board doesn't ask questions. You could have mentioned this earlier." You could have asked. She wanted to argue, but the attorney who'd finally given her name, Sandra, had pulled up in a car and was waving at them with the energy of someone who had 6 more meetings. The apartment in River North was not a unit. It was the top floor of a building that had probably been featured in architecture magazines, with windows that ran floor to ceiling and a kitchen that looked like it had been designed for a cooking show no one had ever watched. Adrienne stood in the middle of it and tried to calculate the square footage, because it was easier than calculating what she'd agreed to. "There's a room for Rosie," Bennett said from somewhere behind her. "And your room is down the hall. You'll have your own bathroom. I won't be in your space. It's very large." "I know." He sounded like he found it faintly ridiculous, which was the first thing he'd said that she agreed with completely. "I told them something smaller would work. They said no, because optics, because my father wants to believe things are normal." His voice changed slightly on that sentence. Not much, just enough that she filed it away. Rosie arrived 2 days later, delivered by a small woman in her 60s named Dorothy, who had the look of someone who'd been managing the Hargrove family long before any of the Hargroves themselves had opinions about it. She watched Bennett scoop Rosie up from the doorway and observed Adrienne with the particular attention of someone taking an inventory. "She's protective of him," Dorothy said quietly, once Bennett had taken Rosie down the hall to see her new room. "Always has been. She'll test you. Not with tantrums. With questions. What kind of questions? The kind children ask when they've had to learn too young that adults don't always stay." Adrienne thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. That night, after Rosie had demanded a full tour of the apartment and given detailed opinions on every room, she found Adrienne in the kitchen and climbed onto a bar stool without being invited. She put her chin in her hands and looked at Adrienne with her father's eyes. "Are you nice?" she asked. "I try to be. Dad says trying matters. Your dad is right." Rosie thought about this. "He doesn't bring people home usually. Not grown-ups." "I know," Adrienne said. "I think this is new for him too. Are you going to stay?" The question was so direct it almost knocked the breath out of her. Adrienne had negotiated contracts worth 9 figures. She'd walked into rooms where no one wanted her there and made herself necessary. But this 5-year-old in a horse sweatshirt had just asked her the one question she genuinely didn't know how to answer. "I'm going to be here for a while," she said carefully. "I can promise that." Rosie considered this with an expression that was either acceptance or diplomatic patience. Then she slid off the bar stool. "Okay," she said. "Dad's making pasta. He puts butter and too much cheese, and it's really good. You should come." The first week at Hargrove Capital was an exercise in controlled chaos. Adrienne walked in on a Monday morning in a charcoal blazer that she'd chosen specifically because it said, "I am not asking for permission to be here," and she sat at the head of a conference table full of people who'd been waiting for her to fail since before she'd signed the contract. The CFO was a man named Thomas who smiled too much and CC'd too many people on emails. The COO, a woman named Cassandra Holt, was sharper, watchful in a way that could mean either threat or potential ally, and Adrienne wasn't sure yet which. The board had 7 members. 3 were actively hostile. 2 were waiting to see which way the wind blew. The remaining 2, she'd been told by Bennett the night before over pasta with too much butter, were people his father had trusted, which meant they were people she could probably trust. Probably. "The infrastructure division is where we start," she said at that first meeting. Because she'd spent the previous 72 hours reviewing financials with Bennett in his office at 10 p.m. while Rosie slept, and Dorothy watched television in the next room. "It's the most stable. We consolidate there, demonstrate growth, and we don't touch the legacy portfolio until we have something to point at." Thomas opened his mouth. "I've read the Q3 reports," Adrienne said before he could. "All of them, including the footnotes." He closed his mouth. Cassandra made a small sound that might have been approval, or indigestion. Adrienne filed that away too. She called Bennett from the car at 6 p.m. "Your CFO is a problem. I know. He expected me to walk in unprepared. Most people who get parachuted into positions like this do. I'm not most people. I know that too." A pause. "Rosie wants to know if you're coming home for dinner." The word home snagged somewhere in her chest. "Tell her yes. And tell her I have a question about the horse's career trajectory." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She hung up before she could decide. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt stranger and stranger the more comfortable it became. Adrienne went to work. She navigated board politics with increasing confidence. She came home to Rosie's running commentary on everything from the weather to the correct number of pillows a horse should have in a stable. Bennett continued whatever he did during the days. She'd stopped pretending it was just building maintenance, and came back for dinner with an attention and quiet that she'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding, without meaning to, steady. One evening, almost 6 weeks in, she came home to find them in the kitchen. Bennett was teaching Rosie to crack an egg. This was apparently a very serious endeavor. Rosie's brow was furrowed. Her tongue was between her teeth. The egg made it into the bowl intact, and she looked up at her father with an expression of pure triumph that Adrienne felt from the doorway. "Did you see that?" Rosie demanded, spotting her. "I saw it," Adrienne said. "I didn't break the yolk even a little. That's very skilled. Dad says it takes practice, but I did it first try." She turned back to the bowl. "Maybe I'm a chef. The horse was a chef once." Bennett looked up over Rosie's head and met Adrienne's eyes. Something passed between them that neither of them named. She went to wash her hands and help with dinner, and if her hands were slightly unsteady for a moment at the sink, there was no one there to notice. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, as trouble often does. Cassandra knocked on Adrienne's office door at 8:30 in the morning with an expression that had stopped pretending to be neutral. "The Shelton Group is pulling out," she said. "Define pulling out, complete withdrawal. They were 48 hours from signing. Now they're not." Cassandra set a tablet on the desk. "Their CEO sent this an hour ago. The language is generic. The timing isn't." Adrienne read it twice. Then she called an emergency meeting. Thomas arrived looking like someone had given him a gift. He settled into his chair with the particular smugness of a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "These things happen," he said. "New leadership always has an adjustment period. The Shelton Group was stable," Adrienne said, "until 36 hours ago. Someone got to them, or they reassessed. The market. Thomas." She kept her voice even. "I've read your last 4 performance reviews. I know what your relationship with the Shelton Group's board looks like. So before you finish that sentence, I'd like you to think carefully about what you're implying and whether you're prepared for where that conversation goes." The room went quiet. Cassandra was definitely not hiding a smile this time. She was choosing not to show it, which was different. By the time the meeting ended, Adrienne had an action plan and a migraine, and Thomas had said nothing else worth noting. That evening, she laid everything out to Bennett in his office, the same way she'd been laying out problems for 6 weeks, because somewhere along the way he'd become the person she brought problems to, and she hadn't decided yet whether to be unsettled by that. "Someone is positioning you to fail," he said. "The Shelton thing is too deliberate. I know. The question is whether it's Thomas acting alone or whether someone on the board put him up to it." Bennett was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was different from most people's silence. It felt like thought rather than absence. "I can find out," he said. "How? You're not supposed to be involved in the board operations. The whole point is that I'm not visible." He looked at her. "That doesn't mean I'm without resources. I've been managing this family's relationships from a distance for 3 years. I know where the loyalties are. This isn't your fight. You became my wife 6 weeks ago." He said it without drama, just fact. "That makes your fights mine. The only question is whether you'll let me actually help or whether you're going to insist on handling it alone." She wanted to argue. She thought about her brother, about the way she'd been quietly managing his situation without telling a soul, about the 12 years she'd spent making herself necessary in rooms that didn't want her by being the person who never needed anything. She thought about how exhausting that was. "Tell me what you know," she said. What he knew was considerable. Bennett had spent 3 years appearing to be someone without power or information, and in doing so had become someone with a great deal of both. He laid it out methodically. The board member who'd been promised Thomas's promotion, the competing firm that had approached the Shelton Group a month ago, the financial irregularities in a subsidiary that Thomas managed and no one had looked at carefully enough. "That's evidence of something that could end his career," Adrienne said. "It's leverage. Whether we use it or not is your decision." "Why my decision?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you're the one he went after, and because you're the CEO. How we handle this should reflect who you want to be in that role. Not what I think, not what the board expects, who you want to be." She thought about that for a long time. In the end, she didn't use the leverage as a weapon. She used it as a door. She went to Thomas directly, early on a Thursday morning, before anyone else arrived, and she laid it out quietly and without theater. She wasn't interested in destroying his career. She was interested in him understanding that his career was something she held in her hands and had chosen for now to put down. He withdrew his interference with the Shelton Group by afternoon. The group re-engaged by Friday. "How?" Cassandra asked, catching Adrienne in the hallway. "I had a direct conversation with Thomas." Cassandra looked at her with an expression that had fully crossed into respect. "You have to know he's going to try something else." "I know, but now he knows what I have." Adrienne adjusted her bag. "Let him decide whether it's worth it." Cassandra walked with her to the elevator. "I didn't vote for this, you know. When the board brought your name forward, I thought it was too unconventional. And now? Now I think unconventional might be exactly what this place needs." She paused at the elevator doors. I'd like to be useful, if you want that. I do, Adrienne said, and meant it. That night, she came home to Rosie at the kitchen table with a worksheet she needed help with, and Bennett making something that smelled like garlic and rosemary, and Dorothy watching something loud in the other room. Adrienne sat down next to Rosie and read the worksheet twice and helped her sound out the words, and it was the most ordinary thing she'd done in weeks. It felt, in a way she wasn't prepared for, like relief. You look different, Rosie observed, mid-worksheet. Different how? Less like the building is on fire. Rosie colored in a circle. You always look like you're trying to stop a fire. That's a very accurate description of my job. Dad says sometimes fires go out by themselves if you don't panic. Rosie looked up. Did your fire go out? I think I figured out how to put it out. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her worksheet. Bennett set a glass of water on the table near Adrienne's elbow without being asked and went back to the stove. She looked at the back of him, the particular steadiness of him, the way he moved through a space like he'd already thought about where everything was, and felt something she didn't have a name for, yet settle somewhere in her chest. It was around this time that she started noticing the things she was trying not to notice. The way Bennett was there for dinner but gone before she woke up, and the way he didn't explain where he went and she'd stopped asking. The car parked on their block for 3 days in a row that he'd noticed before she did. The phone call he'd stepped outside to take, and when he came back, something in his face had shifted. Tell me what's happening, she said that night after Rosie was in bed. Nothing you need to worry about. That's not the agreement we made. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. The agreement was that I would walk into something without knowing everything about it. I've done that. I've been doing it for 2 months. But if there's something that puts Rosie at risk, it doesn't, Bennett. He looked at her. The way he looked at her sometimes, like he was making a decision. 3 years ago, I left Hargrove Capital because I found something. Financial connections between the family's investment arm and a consortium that was doing things that weren't legal. He stopped. I didn't go to the authorities immediately. I should have. I was trying to protect my father's reputation. While I was deciding, things happened. What things? Rosie's mother. His voice stayed even, but it cost him something. Mara wasn't an accident. She was a warning, and I didn't understand that until after. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Adrienne heard the refrigerator hum. Outside, a car passed. They think you're coming back now, she said. Into the company, into visibility. Someone does. I don't know who. I thought I'd been careful enough. He looked at the table. The people I was connected to 3 years ago, most of them are gone. The consortium restructured. New players. But someone remembered. And you didn't tell me this before I signed the contract? No, because I needed someone real. Someone who'd actually do the job, not someone performing it. If I'd told you at the beginning, you would have negotiated differently. Held yourself further back. Treated Rosie as a variable. He looked at her. You didn't, and that mattered. She wanted to be angry. She examined the feeling carefully, the way she'd been taught to examine things before acting on them. Under the anger was something more complicated. The recognition that he wasn't wrong. I need to know everything now, she said. I know all of it. Yes, he told her. It took 2 hours. By the end, she understood why he'd spent 3 years in a walk-up in Pilsen with his daughter and a toolbox, and why he'd been watching that car on their block, and why the men who'd come to the apartment 2 weeks ago, men she'd assumed were board representatives, had left with a tension that wasn't just corporate. What do we do? She asked. I've been building something, he said. Quietly. Evidence. People who can corroborate. I wasn't ready to move yet, but if they're making contact again, the timeline changes. You need to tell the authorities. I need to be careful about which authorities. Some of the people involved have reach. He looked at her. I need time, and I need the Hargrove Capital position to look stable, untouchable, which means I need you. You've had me for 2 months. I need you to know why, which is different from just having you there. She thought about her brother. About the reason she'd said yes in the first place, not just the money, but the possibility of doing something that required her to be fully present, fully capable, fully herself. She hadn't expected this to be what it required. I'm not going anywhere, she said, but we do this together. No more going quiet when something changes. No more handled. He held her gaze, agreed. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no declarations. But something realigned between them, the way things do when honesty finally catches up with circumstances. And Adrienne went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't expected to feel in this apartment. Safe. The gala was Cassandra's idea, technically, though the board had been planning it for months. Annual fundraiser, black tie, all executives expected to attend. The invitation said "and guest," which in their case meant the whole arrangement was about to go public in a way that press releases hadn't quite managed. "You don't have to come," Adrienne told Bennett. "You want me to not come? I want you to want to come. There's a difference." He looked at her in the way that she'd learned, meant he was about to say something straightforward that she wasn't going to know what to do with. "I want to come," he said. She didn't know what to do with it. She got dressed. The venue was the kind of place where the chandelier had a name. Adrienne wore deep blue because Rosie had voted for it emphatically over everything else in the closet, and Bennett wore a suit that fit him like he'd grown up being dressed for rooms like this, which of course he had. Thomas found them within 15 minutes. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, with the tone of someone who'd been storing that name in his mouth for a while. "I didn't realize you'd be attending." "It's a family event," Bennett said pleasantly. "Seemed appropriate." Of course. Thomas's gaze moved between them with a calculation he wasn't quite hiding. "The resemblance to your father is remarkable. I imagine the board finds that reassuring." "I imagine they find results reassuring," Bennett said. "Adrienne's been delivering those." Thomas's smile thinned. He moved on. The evening was a performance, and Adrienne was good at performances. She moved through the room, spoke to board members, absorbed information about alliances and rivalries. Bennett stayed close without hovering, knew when to speak and when to simply be there, knew how to exit conversations gracefully, and how to read a room. She kept catching herself noticing this. "You're good at this," she said during a quiet moment near the windows. "I grew up doing it. Doesn't mean I like it. What do you like?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't answer reflexively. "I like problems with solutions, mechanical things, things where if you do the work correctly, the thing runs." He glanced at her. "I like Rosie's drawings. I like knowing what's going to happen next." "This isn't a great environment for that last one." "No." He looked at the room. "But some things are worth the uncertainty." She was deciding whether to ask what he meant when Thomas reappeared, this time with someone she didn't recognize. Older man, silver-haired, the kind of confident that came from decades of not being questioned. "Adrienne," Thomas said, "I'd like you to meet Gerald Forsyth. He's a longtime associate of the Hargrove family, very interested in the current transition." Forsyth's eyes moved to Bennett and stayed there. "Bennett Hargrove," he said. "Your father must be pleased. He's getting there," Bennett said, "and you're back in the fold." "Remarkable." Forsyth's smile didn't move. "I understand you've been keeping a low profile. Very wise. In your position, I would have done the same. What position is that? A man with things to protect." Forsyth glanced at Adrienne. A new wife, a daughter, a family to think about. He let that settle for exactly 1 second. It would be a shame if anything complicated the rebuild. He moved away before either of them could respond. "He's connected to them," Adrienne said quietly. "Yes, he was warning you, yes." Bennett's voice was even, but she could feel the shift in him. "We need to move the timeline." The drive home was quiet. Bennett spent most of it on his phone, texting someone in a way that had the focused efficiency of someone who already knew what the next step was. Adrienne watched the city go by and thought about Rosie asleep at home with Dorothy, and about what it meant that a man she'd married as a business arrangement was now the person she most wanted to talk to when something went wrong. She didn't say any of that in the car. When they got home, Dorothy took one look at their faces and said goodnight without comment. Adrienne checked on Rosie, who was asleep with one arm around a stuffed horse, and her blanket kicked entirely off the bed. She pulled it back over her. Rosie stirred but didn't wake. She found Bennett in the kitchen. "Tell me the timeline," she said. "I have enough now. Evidence, witnesses, documentation. What I need is the right federal contact, someone who isn't compromised." He looked up from his laptop. "And I need about 3 more weeks. Is that realistic given tonight?" Forsyth was testing whether I'd spook. "If I spook, they know I have something. If I stay calm, maintain the position, keep Hargrove Capital stable. You use me as cover. I use us as cover." He held her gaze. "I know that's not what you signed up for. I signed up for something I didn't fully understand. That's different." She sat down. "What do you need from me? Keep doing what you're doing. The board is starting to believe in the transition. That stability is the best protection I have right now." "And Rosie?" "Dorothy will take her to my aunt's this weekend, just as a precaution. She'll think it's a visit." Adrienne nodded. Then, because she'd been holding it for a while, "You should have told me from the beginning." "I know." I would have still said yes. He looked at her. "You don't know that. I do, because of Rosie." She met his eyes. "I would have said yes for a lot of reasons, but that one would have been enough." The silence was the kind that meant something. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, the call came. A federal contact Bennett had been cultivating for months. Someone outside the reach of the consortium influences was ready. The documentation was complete. The arrests would happen within 72 hours. Adrienne was in the kitchen with Rosie, who's explaining at great length that the horse had decided to become a marine biologist, when Bennett came in and looked at her over Rosie's head. "It's time," he said. She understood immediately. She kept her voice even for Rosie. "Hey, Bug, I need to talk to your dad for a minute. Can you keep working on the marine biologist?" "She needs a tank," Rosie said, already reaching for the blue crayon. "Horses can swim, actually. Most people don't know that." In the hallway, Bennett said, "Forsyth's been in contact. He knows something's moving if he gets ahead of it. He won't, not if the federal team moves now." She looked at him. "You've been building this for 3 years. Trust it." He was quiet for a moment. If it goes wrong, we deal with it together." She kept her voice steady. "That's what we said." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. 72 hours later, Gerald Forsyth and 4 senior members of the consortium were arrested. 2 others surrendered voluntarily in exchange for cooperation agreements. Thomas resigned from Hargrove Capital by the end of the week. The financial irregularities Bennett had documented made his position untenable, though that story was told quietly, which was, Adrienne decided, the appropriate level of mercy. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the arrests, Adrienne was reading Rosie a book about ocean life, a choice Rosie had made with great deliberation to support the horse's new career. When she felt the weight of what had actually happened settle into her bones. Not the crisis, not the legal proceedings, not the board meetings she'd navigated. The fact that this apartment had become, without her planning it, the place she wanted to come back to. "Mrs. Adrienne," Rosie said, turning a page, "are you going to leave when your year is done?" Adrienne looked at her. "What year?" "The year you said." Rosie's finger traced a drawing of a blue whale. "I heard Dorothy and Dad talking. She said you had a deal for a year and then you might go. Dad said he didn't know." She looked up. "I want you to stay." The simplicity of it. The absolute uncomplicated directness of being 5 and saying the true thing. "I want to stay too," Adrienne said. "Do you want to tell Dad that?" "Because I think maybe he wants you to, but he doesn't know you want to, and he doesn't say things until he's sure. You know your dad pretty well." "I pay attention." Rosie turned another page. "Dorothy says the women in our family always had to pay attention or nothing would get done." Adrienne kissed the top of her head. "Dorothy's right." That night, after Rosie was asleep, Adrienne found Bennett on the balcony looking out at the lights. She stood beside him. "The contract expires in 4 months," she said. "I know. I've been thinking about what happens after." He turned to look at her, and, "I think we built something." She held his gaze. "Not what the contract described. Something else. Something I wasn't expecting and didn't plan for, and I'm not going to pretend isn't real. Adrienne, let me finish." She'd been rehearsing this, not in words, but in the feeling under the words, making sure she understood it before she said it. "You spent 3 years protecting Rosie by keeping her world small. I understand why, but she needs it to be bigger now, and I want to be part of bigger." She paused. "If you want that." He was quiet for a moment. "The mechanic from Pilsen might not be what you expected when you signed the contract. The mechanic from Pilsen is exactly what I found when I stopped expecting something specific." He turned back to the city. Then, "I haven't been sure of many things in the last 3 years. But I've been sure about you since that afternoon you sat in my kitchen and drew that terrible saddle. It was a very bad saddle. The worst I've ever seen." Something in his voice shifted to the warmer thing she'd come to recognize, the thing he usually kept private. "I'd like to renew the contract. Under different terms. Permanent ones? What kind of terms? The kind where you're my actual wife, where Rosie knows it's real, where we build it properly with no end date in the fine print." She looked at him. This man she'd married in 11 minutes, who had turned out to contain more than she'd known how to look for. "Yes," she said. He smiled. The real one, the one she'd only seen a handful of times, and each time it had caught her off guard. They stood on the balcony for a long time after that. The city moved below them, bright and indifferent. Inside, Rosie was dreaming about horses in the ocean. Dorothy had left a note on the counter that said about time in her very small, very precise handwriting. A month later, they did it again. The ceremony, the promises. Small this time, intentional. Rosie wore a purple dress she'd chosen herself and spent the reception explaining to anyone who would listen that horses were excellent swimmers and that she was thinking about becoming a marine biologist or possibly an astronaut. But the horse hadn't decided yet, so she was keeping her options open. Dorothy cried. Bennett didn't, but he held Rosie on one side and Adrienne's hand on the other, and the look on his face was enough. Afterward, they drove home. Rosie fell asleep in the car with her forehead against the window. Bennett carried her up. Adrienne turned down the blankets. They stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. "She's going to be exactly like Dorothy when she grows up." Adrienne said quietly. She's already exactly like Dorothy. She just doesn't know it yet. They let her sleep. In the kitchen, Adrienne made tea, and Bennett put the leftover cake in the refrigerator, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine, because they'd reached the point where the quiet between them was the comfortable kind. The kind built from months of learning each other's actual shapes, rather than the shapes they'd agreed to perform. She'd walked into this looking for a way to fix something broken. Her brother's bills, her career, the quiet accumulation of years spent making herself useful to institutions that didn't quite see her. She'd expected a transaction. She'd found instead a life that fit, not perfectly. It had rough edges and unanswered questions and a 5-year-old who woke up at 6 a.m., convinced that horses were the key to everything. It had a man who still went quiet when he was scared and needed to be asked directly. It had a board she'd have to keep managing and a family history that would probably generate complications for years. But it also had this: Tuesday dinners and crayon horses with rotating careers and a daughter who handed crayons to people she decided to trust. It had a man who'd spent 3 years protecting the thing he loved most by becoming invisible, and who had slowly, carefully let her in. And it had the drawing. The one she'd found on her desk that first morning, which she'd later discovered Rosie had taped there herself while Adrienne was in the shower. A crayon house with 4 stick figures. Our family, spelled wrong in purple. She kept it in her desk drawer at Hargrove Capital. Some things you didn't need to frame to know they were worth keeping.